They were already losing the city. Buildings burned on every single block. Thick, oily smoke turned the morning sunrise into a dull, bruised red haze. The relentless sound of heavy artillery rolled across the shattered skyline like distant mechanical thunder. And in the dead center of that absolute chaos, an entire armored convoy suddenly stopped moving. 22 massive vehicles, 300 battle-hardened soldiers, over 1,000 tons of steel, weaponry, and human life, all of it frozen. All because the commander of the lead tank refused to move a single inch forward. His superiors screamed at him over the radio. His crew questioned his sanity. The entire column was sitting completely exposed in a hostile war zone, waiting to be wiped out. And nobody knew why. Before we dive into exactly what this tank commander saw that saved 300 lives, I want to welcome you to the channel. War stories like this aren't just about the massive battles or the heavy artillery. They are about the tiny, almost invisible details that decide whether soldiers live or die. If you enjoy powerful, deep-dive military stories that examine the human psychology of combat, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. And I want to know who is watching this with me today. Drop down into the comments right now and tell me, where are you watching from? What country? What city? Let's get back to the story. The order to retreat came 2 hours before dawn. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal. It wasn't a strategic repositioning. It was a desperate, bloody retreat. Pull out immediately. The city of Darwin had become a total trap. For 3 weeks, the coalition forces had tried to hold the center, but the sheer numbers of the enemy were overwhelming. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't fight in standard formations. They were a ghost army, melting into the rubble, using the city's destroyed infrastructure as their own personal fortress. Overnight, enemy fighters had poured into the eastern and northern streets. They had systematically cut off the primary supply routes. They had ambushed the midnight patrols. Now, aerial surveillance drones were reporting dozens of armed technicals and heavy infantry moving rapidly toward the Western District. The Western District was the only exit route left for the remaining troops. It was a closing noose. If the convoy didn't pack up and leave right this second, they would be completely surrounded. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no air support. There would only be a slaughter. So the order from high command was simple, blunt, and terrifying. Get out, fast. Armored vehicles roared to life across the crumbling concrete of the military compound. Massive diesel engines thundered, vibrating the teeth of the men standing near them. Heavy steel tracks tore through the broken pavement as the convoy assembled. Inside the lead tank, the tip of the spear, sat Sergeant Viktor Karev, 34 years old. 7 years commanding heavy armor. He was a man who spoke very little, but saw absolutely everything. He had fought in scorched deserts, frozen mountains, and pulverized cities that didn't even exist on modern maps anymore. Karev knew what a winning battle felt like. He knew the rhythm of a successful push, but he also knew what a massacre felt like before it happened. And the look on his face that morning was different from anything his crew had ever seen. He didn't look angry. He didn't look focused. He looked deeply uneasy. A tank is not just a machine. It is a living, breathing organism, and the crew is its nervous system. Beneath Karev sat Misha, the driver, 22 years old, barely out of basic training, but with hands fast enough to thread a 70-ton needle through a needle's eye. To his right was Petrov, the gunner, a quiet, calculating man whose eye was permanently pressed against the thermal optics. And deep in the hole was Anton, the loader, surrounded by dozens of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. They trusted Karev with their lives. If Karev told them to drive into a lake, Misha would ask how deep. If Karev told Petrov to shoot the moon, Petrov would ask for the wind trajectory. But today, the tension inside the cramped, sweaty steel box of the turret was suffocating. The smell of hydraulic fluid, old sweat, and burnt diesel hung heavy in the air. None of them wanted to be the lead tank today. The lead tank is the pathfinder. The lead tank is the one that finds the mines. The lead tank takes the first rocket behind them. The convoy stretched out for almost half a mile. The heavy main battle tanks took the front. Behind them rolled the armored personnel carriers, heavily laden with infantry. And finally, the soft-skinned supply trucks bringing up the rear, carrying whatever ammunition and rations they hadn't burned in the last 72 hours. The soldiers sitting in the back of those transports sat in total, agonizing silence. Some obsessively checked their rifles, racking the bolts over and over again. Some stared blankly at the metal floor, lost in memories of home. Some whispered quiet, desperate prayers, kissing worn photographs or silver crosses pulled from beneath their body armor. Outside, the streets of Darwin were terrifyingly empty. No civilians running for cover, no stray traffic, just the jagged teeth of shattered windows, the blackened frames of burned-out cars, and the constant, rhythmic echo of distant gunfire. It felt deeply wrong. It was too quiet. In urban warfare, silence is never peaceful. Silence is a predator holding its breath. Inside Karev's tank, the radio suddenly crackled, breaking the heavy silence. "Convoy leader, what is your status?" It was Captain Vance, the convoy commander, sitting in a heavily armored vehicle 300 meters back. His voice was tight with anxiety. Karev keyed his mic, his voice a flat, emotionless drawl. "Column is moving. Actual. 2 minutes to Checkpoint Road." The road ahead Checkpoint Road was the absolute crucial bottleneck. It was the only unblocked, viable path leading west out of the city center. It was a narrow, claustrophobic street cutting directly between 2 rows of towering, brutalist apartment blocks, 8 stories high on either side. If they cleared that street, they hit the highway. They were out. They lived. If they didn't, nobody in the convoy allowed themselves to finish that sentence. The convoy rolled forward. Tank tracks ground brutally against the asphalt, crushing loose bricks into powder. Thick clouds of dust and diesel exhaust rose behind them, marking their position to anyone watching from the sky. The lead tank turned the final corner. Misha, the driver, instinctively eased off the throttle as they entered the narrow street. The massive engine dropped to a low, throaty rumble. The tall buildings towered over them on both sides, casting long, dark shadows across the road. Every window was completely dark. Every balcony was empty. The streets stretched ahead for almost 300 meters. A straight, uncompromising line. To a civilian, it looked like a ruined street. To a tactician, it looked like a graveyard. It was the perfect choke point, the perfect kill zone. A textbook ambush location where high ground dictated survival, and the convoy had none of it. Karev stood up in the commander's hatch, exposing his head and shoulders to the morning air. He scanned the rooftops through his heavy binoculars. Left side, clear. Right side, clear. No glint of a sniper scope. No shadow of an RPG gunner. No movement whatsoever. Still. The hair on the back of Karev's neck stood up. His stomach tightened into a knot of ice. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Then, suddenly, Karev dropped back down into the turret and said one single word. Stop. Misha didn't question it. He slammed the heavy brakes. The 70-ton war machine screeched to a violent, shuddering halt right in the dead center of the road. The momentum threw the crew forward against their harnesses. Behind them, the chain reaction was immediate and terrifying. Tanks and armored transports slammed on their brakes. Drivers swerved to avoid rear-ending the vehicle in front of them. The entire half-mile column accordioned together, metal groaning, dust kicking up in massive plumes. Within seconds, the radios exploded with pure confusion and rising panic. Why are we stopping? Lead tank, what is the holdup? Move the damn column, we're exposed. But Karev didn't answer the radio. He just stood there in the hatch, staring dead ahead at the empty street. Down in the turret, Petrov, the gunner, frowned, his hands hovering over the firing controls. Sergeant, what's wrong? Do you have a target? Karev didn't respond. His eyes were darting back and forth across the asphalt. Instead, he muttered quietly, almost to himself, "Something's missing." The crew looked at each other, their eyes wide in the dim light of the screens. Missing? What could possibly be missing from a completely obliterated war zone? Captain Vance's voice came over the primary command net. It was no longer anxious. It was furious. Lead tank, this is actual. Move your vehicle immediately. You are blocking the exit route. Karev still didn't move. He reached down and clicked his radio off. Behind them, the situation was degrading rapidly. Soft-skinned supply trucks were piling up in the rear intersections. 300 soldiers were sitting in thin metal boxes, completely exposed from every single angle. If this was an ambush location, if the enemy was waiting, they had just handed them the perfect opportunity. They were sitting ducks. Vance switched to the emergency override channel, his voice booming through the tank's intercom. Karev, that is a direct order. Put that machine in gear and push forward now. Inside the driver's compartment, Misha's hands were shaking on the steering yokes. He looked up toward the turret. Sergeant, with all due respect, we have to move. They're going to court-martial you. Or worse, we're going to get blown to pieces. But Karev completely ignored him. His brain was working in overdrive, filtering through thousands of hours of combat experience, looking for the tiny piece of the puzzle that was screaming at his subconscious. He scanned the windows. He scanned the heavy wooden doors. He scanned the piles of trash in the side alleys. Then his eyes narrowed. His breath hitched. He leaned closer to his digital periscope, magnifying the image. And finally, his voice cut through the tension in the tank like a knife. That dog. The crew blinked in unison. Petrov looked up from his thermal screen. What? Karev pointed a gloved finger straight toward the center of the road, about 100 meters ahead. There's always a dog right there. Misha groaned. Sergeant, have you lost your mind? Shut up and listen to me, Karev snapped, the authority returning to his voice. He explained rapidly. For the last 2 weeks, his platoon had been stationed near this exact sector. Every single morning, when the sun crested the buildings and warmed the asphalt, every patrol that passed this street saw the exact same thing. A stray dog, skinny, mangy, brown fur. It slept right in the dead center of the road, soaking up the heat from the pavement. When convoys rolled by, it never moved. When artillery shelled the distant suburbs, it never barked. When gunfire echoed down the alleys, It barely twitched its ears. It just slept there, an unbothered survivor of a fallen city, every single day, except today. The dog was completely gone. Misha shook his head, the panic creeping into his voice. "Sergeant, are you serious? We are halting a division-level retreat. We are defying a direct order from the commander because a stray dog decided to go look for food." Karev dropped back down into his seat, his eyes blazing. "No, Misha." He pointed to the periscope screen. "We're stopping because the street is too damn clean." The crew leaned in and looked closely at the monitors. Suddenly, the illusion shattered. Once Karev pointed it out, it was violently obvious. No trash, no loose debris, no shattered glass, no brass bullet casings. In a city that had been pulverized by high explosives for a month, where every single street was a treacherous carpet of rubble and ruin, this specific 300-meter stretch of road was spotless. It looked like it had been swept with a broom. Because it had been. And then Karev saw the final piece of the puzzle. Down on the ground, hovering barely an inch above the asphalt, a thin, almost invisible line stretching from the edge of a burnt-out car on the left, all the way to a concrete pillar on the right, a tripwire. Karev grabbed his comms helmet. He didn't use the standard convoy frequency. He used the all-hands emergency broadcast channel. All vehicles, halt in place. Do not advance. I repeat, do not advance. Captain Vance snapped back instantly, his rage boiling over. "Karev, you are relieved of command." "I am sending Karev," cut him off, his voice absolute ice. "Actual, shut up and listen. We have an IED grid spanning the entire width of Checkpoint Road." Total, suffocating silence filled the radio channel. An IED, an improvised explosive device. But Karev hadn't said one device. He said a grid. A single IED could disable a tank. A grid meant dozens of them, wired together in a daisy-chain sequence. It was a weapon designed not to kill a vehicle, but to vaporize an entire armored column in a single, catastrophic chain reaction. Vance's voice returned, suddenly stripped of all its anger. It was replaced by cold dread. "Lead tank. Confirm your visual." Karev slapped Petrov on the shoulder. "Thermals. Look under the street. Maximum penetration." Petrov's fingers flew across his console. He switched the optics from visual to thermal imaging, dialing up the sensitivity to detect heat signatures beneath the surface of the road. The screen flickered, and then Petrov physically recoiled from his screen, his face turning pale. Oh my God. The screen was glowing white. Buried just beneath the thin layer of swept asphalt were massive, glowing heat signatures. They weren't artillery shells. They were massive plastic barrels. 55-gallon drums packed to the brim with military-grade explosives, fertilizer, and diesel fuel. There wasn't just one. There were 6 of them, spaced perfectly 20 meters apart, running directly down the center of the road. If Misha had driven the tank just 10 more meters forward, the 70-ton weight of the tank, or the snapping of that single wire, would have completed the electrical circuit. The entire street would have detonated simultaneously. The force of the blast would have channeled directly upward, trapped between the concrete walls of the apartment buildings, multiplying its destructive power. 22 vehicles, 300 soldiers. They wouldn't have just been killed. They would have been turned to ash in a fraction of a second, before anyone could process the horror of what lay beneath them. The silence of the morning was shattered. The enemy realized their trap had been discovered. The convoy wasn't moving into the kill zone, so they sprang the ambush anyway. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from the rooftops of the apartment blocks. Tracers tore through the morning haze, sparking violently against the thick armor of Karev's tank. The sharp crack-whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade echoed down the street, the warhead slamming into the reinforced concrete just inches from the tank's hull. They had been waiting patiently in the shadows for the convoy to drive perfectly into the center of the street before blowing the charges. But because Karev had stopped, the convoy was out of the primary blast radius, and the enemy was forced to engage from a distance. Karev didn't flinch. His training took over entirely. Rooftop right, 4th floor balcony. High, explosive, up. Anton screamed, slamming a massive 120mm. He rounded into the breach. Fire. The tank's main cannon roared, a deafening explosion of fire and pressure that shook the earth. The entire corner of the apartment building simply ceased to exist, vanishing in a massive cloud of pulverized concrete and smoke. Down the line, the rest of the convoy woke up. Heavy .50 caliber machine guns mounted on the transports opened up, their deep, rhythmic pounding chewing through the brick facades of the buildings. Infantrymen spilled out of the carriers, taking cover behind the heavy tracks of the tanks, returning fire with lethal precision. The ambush turned into total chaos. The enemy had relied entirely on the shock and awe of the IED grid. Without it, they were just light infantry fighting heavy armor in a head-on engagement. Within 10 minutes of brutal, overwhelming, suppressive fire, the enemy fighters broke contact and retreated deeper into the ruins. Their trap had failed. The guns went silent. 2 hours later, after securing a massive perimeter, the convoy's combat engineers finally moved in to inspect the road. They moved slowly, sweeping every inch of dirt. What they found made even the most veteran explosives experts sick to their stomachs. Buried beneath the asphalt was over 2,000 kilograms of explosives. It was one of the largest daisy-chained IEDs the engineers had ever seen in the theater of war. It was wired with extreme precision. If Karev had moved forward just 5 more meters, there would have been no convoy left to retreat. Later that night, long after the sun had set, the convoy finally reached the safety of the Western Coalition base. The dust settled. The engines were finally turned off. Soldiers stumbled out of their transports, utterly exhausted, covered in grime and sweat. Slowly, a crowd began to gather around the lead tank. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The reality of how close they had come to death was too heavy for that. Some officers walked up and simply shook Karev's hand in silence. Some soldiers just stood from a distance and stared at him. Finally, a young private, his face streaked with dirt and grease, walked up to the tank. He looked up at Karev, who was sitting on the edge of the turret, smoking a cigarette. "Sergeant," the private asked, his voice trembling slightly, "how did you know? How did you actually know it was there?" Karev took a slow drag from his cigarette. He looked out past the barbed wire of the base, toward the distant burning skyline of Darvan. He thought about the smoke. He thought about the swept street. He thought about the wire. And he said quietly, "Because war changes everything about men." He exhaled the smoke. But animals still act normal. 7 weeks later, the tide of the war shifted. Fresh reinforcements arrived, and Karev's armored division led the counteroffensive back into the heart of Darvan. They pushed through the western district, They cleared the sectors block by block, and eventually Karev's tank rolled back down that exact same street. The street was still there. The massive crater from the defused bombs had been hastily filled with gravel. The buildings were still heavily scarred, pockmarked with thousands of bullet holes from the ambush. Misha slowed the tank down as they approached the center of the road. Karev looked through his periscope, and there, right in the middle of the warm, sun-baked asphalt, the exact same scruffy, brown dog lay sleeping, oblivious to the tanks, oblivious to the war, just surviving, like absolutely nothing had ever happened. A slow, rare smile crept across Karev's face. "Drive around him," Misha, Karev ordered. "Copy that, Sergeant." The 70-ton machine carefully swerved to the left, leaving the sleeping dog completely untouched, and rolled forward into the city.